Hi there. I want to introduce you to Kat Armas. Say hello, Kat.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, as I thought about women who I wanted to amplify during this Pray Tell book launch, I thought of you. I've followed you from a distance for quite some time and have just been so blessed by your voice and the way you illuminate scripture, especially the lesser known stories. And so, as I thought about this issue of silence and slandering of women and how in church culture, in business and education and politics, that is just the status quo and how that needs to change. Your exposition of the scriptures and deep dive is just, I think, so valuable to this conversation as we talk about how specifically marginalized voices have been so affected by this phenomena and what we can do about it. So I want to first pump your book coming up August 2021. Share it
Yeah.
with the people about your book and just a little nugget about it.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think that I love how our books kind of speak to each other in a way. So my book, like you said, it's coming out August 2021 and it's titled Abuelita Faith. So you did a good job in pronouncing that. I know that that's difficult. But it's essentially about that, right? Like sort of the question that I answer is, what if the greatest theologians the world has ever known are those whom the world wouldn't even consider theologians, right? And I think that that's something that we see so much in scripture. We're used to overlooking a lot of these women because of, how we've been taught to read the Bible or what's been important to us, right? By those in power who have taught us about the Bible. So I just kind of pick out a lot of these unnamed or overlooked women and just tell their story like, hey, and what's I think so fascinating is not just that, oh, here's their story, but how their story shaped society, changed the culture, like how Jesus like called them out, like women of great faith to like people who we would never call people of great faith, right? Or we would just, oh yeah, their faith is fine, but I mean, these are women that just changed the course of history, and they're overlooked, right? And so and a lot of the times they speak truth to power, or they do really audacious things that if we noticed women doing them now, we look twice, right?
Mm.
So that's a little bit what my book is about. And I also tell stories of just women throughout history. So in the Bible, women who protested throughout history, and women who, just did all sorts of things that stories and get overlooked or untold. So
Absolutely. So, from your research and from your study, what would you say is kind of a theme with these women, especially marginalized women, and how they have spoke truth to power, and what we can learn from them?
yeah. Well, what we can learn from them, everything, right? I
Yeah.
feel like there's just so much to take. So one of the things I think and I'll focus on two things that I feel like your question speaks to. The first one is just the notion of survival, right? Something that I noticed is just a lot of women speak truth to power, not because it's trendy or not because, whatever, but because they're just trying to survive. And if they
Yeah.
don't do that, then they're going to die, right?
Yeah.
So
There's a lot
I
on the
feel
line.
so I feel like survival is a big one. And in my book, I try not to romanticize that too much, because I know that it can happen, we can tend to do that. And so I try and just say, hey, a lot of these women are just trying to survive. And I think that that's the reality for a lot of marginalized people. When you're in the margins your whole life, you know a thing or two about resilience, and that just stems from needing to eat, needing to feed your child, needing
Yeah.
to, whatever. So that's the first thing I want to say. And also what survival does to how we understand and see the world, right? Like marginalized women, particularly in scripture, like I think that, when Jesus commends their faith, it's because, I mean, again, it's rooted in survival. Like their
Yeah.
faith is just, they're putting their all in belief in Jesus or being healed by Jesus because they need to wake up the next morning, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And then the second thing that I learned, just the sort of the idea of wisdom, as it pertains to wisdom. The other thing I learned is the idea of embodiment, right? I noticed so much, just how embodiment is a way of life in a lot of these women that I researched throughout history. And it's not, I feel like privilege sort of separates us, right? Like when
Yeah.
we, and I
Absolutely.
include right, like I include myself in this, that, we have to, like, I go to the grocery store to get my food, like I don't have to I don't have to grow it. I can, but I don't have to. I don't have to sew my own clothes. Like I don't have to do a lot of things that a lot of people throughout history, a lot of women throughout history have had to do. So I feel like they have an advantage to just being embodied people. And we've lost the kind of wisdom that comes from just embodiment, right? Embodied wisdom, sewing your own clothes and all these things that I feel like, the divine creator God has instilled in us these, there's a line in my book that I say, like, women carry medicine in their hands. And I believe that that's true when we use our hands to make clothes, to make food, to make all these things, that's wisdom, right? That's an
Yeah.
embodied wisdom. And I feel like, privilege disconnects us from that. And so for me, what I've learned is, how can I reconnect with that? How can I reconnect with the elements and with the things that creator God has put in this world that I can learn from through my body. So yeah, those are two things, just survival and embodiment. I feel like, I've learned a lot in my research and writing my book about those things.
That's beautiful. Talk a little bit about how you have seen um, marginalized voices in history amplified, and then also talk about what it means to listen to marginalized voices now. Where can we go when we do that? Because one of the things that I discovered researching for Pray Tell was how systematically by courts and by holy men and by parole officers and by immigration, this is architected to stifle the voice of whether it's low wage earning, as you mentioned, or undocumented or marginalized women. And I often talk about how, we have white men, we have white women, and then we have women of color. There's just this hierarchy as far as where from a woman of color's vantage point. And I think that especially in the last 5 years, it has been the conversation around silencing women has largely been around white women because that's who we listen to historically. Right. And Bell Hooks and Angela Davis, so many have spoke to that. But what does it mean to listen to marginalized voices? How do we do that? And what could happen if we do?
Yeah. So I love this question. And I think of, like, when you say, when you talk about just listening, right, to marginalized voices, I honestly, I think of Jesus, and I think of one of my favorite lines in scripture in John chapter 20, when Mary, Jesus has died, and she goes to his tomb to, like, look for him, and he's not there, and she starts crying. And she's, like, walking and crying, and, Jesus just comes up to her and says, "Woman, why are you crying?" Like, what, he says, "What are you crying? Or who are you looking for?" And to me, I'm like that blows my mind, because Jesus not only believed women, but Jesus believed in women.
Yeah.
And Jesus, was literally, like, he knew why she was crying, and she, quote unquote, had no reason to cry, right? It may, quote unquote, maybe wasn't, think about it. He told her he would resurrect, right? He said, like, "Hey, I'm going to come back." Like, this is something they all knew. He could have easily been like, "Come on, like, seriously, you didn't listen to me," or like, "Seriously, you weren't paying," but it was just like that simple question, like, "Why are you crying? And who are you looking for?" Like,
Yeah.
I want to hear, I want to listen, like, come talk to me, tell me. So when I think of, like, how can we listen to marginalized women, or just listen to people on the margins? I think it just starts with being like Jesus, right?
Yeah.
That's such a buzz, oh, what would Jesus do? But really, Jesus went straight, and mind you, he said, he asked her these questions after he entrusted her with preaching the gospel for the first time, right? So it was believing in, and then just believing in general, right? So anyway, I think of that so much, because I think it starts with just that question, like, "Hey, why are you crying?" And not obviously in a, "Well, why are you," but like genuinely, like, let me understand this struggle, because like I said, like, privilege disconnects us. And so I think it really just starts with that very first, moment of, like, let me understand this struggle. Why are you crying, right? Like, who or what are you looking for? Because it's in that question that we can initially connect, and then, do what we're called to do, in the sense of, hey, I got these resources. How can I help resource you? Or I have these connections. How can I help just connect you? So yeah, I think of that. I don't know if that answered both of your
Oh, that's
questions.
beautiful. I think there is such a lack of compassion.
Right.
We place what we think we would do over what someone actually did. And because their response to trauma or to trouble or to calamity isn't our perceived or
Right.
probable response, therefore they're wrong or they got themselves in the situation. And I think being able to step back and say, why? Like,
Mhm.
why? In
Yeah.
compassion, with
Right.
appropriate body language and a
Right.
tone of voice and inflection.
Yes.
I think that compassion is so underrated. It's so underrated when we talk about listening to people who are so different than us. And it is so necessary to move the ball forward down the court. And without it, I think we're toast. I think we're
Oh yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
toast. And one of the things that I'm most excited about your work is just, again, amplifying marginalized voices and telling the stories that we might have not known. Um,
Mhm.
the other gals who have joined on to help shape this conversation for this digital summit all have such a beautiful way of seeing this issue of women and what it means to listen to women, but also how we can advance the movement, how we can
Right.
advance women's place in the world. So, what is something that you feel like women need to know, especially in the era of faulty ideology that has um, been so just baked into the evangelical narrative?
Yeah. So like you mentioned earlier, I love the Bible, right? So I love to speak from the Bible. And I think that because our culture so much is shaped by religion or so much shaped by, yeah, I mean, white men in power who have told us what to believe and how to believe. And I think that as Christian women, I think for us, it starts with, and I know that the Bible addresses this, but not all who see, really see, like, right? Like you can see things, but you can't really perceive how they're supposed to be seen, or not all who hear have ears to hear, like let those who hear have ears to hear. And so it's this idea of, sort of retraining how we read and how we see things, and I'll focus on the Bible, right? Because that's sort of like my thing. So just retraining, like, what are we looking for when we read these stories? What
Mm,
are we looking for? How do we, as women who, in many ways our voices have been silenced in spaces, in church spaces or in
yeah.
religious spaces or in whatever space, how can we, yeah, look for things that would normally be overlooked. So look for characters, or look for, storylines or narratives, or and I think in that aspect as well, who around us, can we listen to, right? I think of my own grandmother. Like I talk about abuelita faith and abuelita theology, and for years, I mean, I knew she had wisdom. She's my grandma, right? But like as soon as I became like this, a Protestant Christian, and I started going to seminary and whatever, and I became educated, I felt like it was my job to educate her on everything that I was learning about Jesus, when it's like, she's been doing this thing a lot longer.
Oh,
And she, again, like her life is very much rooted in survival. What in the world do I have to like teach her about a Bible story and how it's interpreted correctly, right? And so I think that, who around us, can we learn from, and
yeah.
listen to different perspectives, and not just for the sake of listening to different perspectives, but for recentering and decentering voices of authority and power in
Yeah.
us, and in scripture, right? Like what are the authoritative voices in scripture? Historically it's been David, right? But then we know how problematic, when you think
Yeah.
about how David treated women, right? And so
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's allowing ourselves to seek out things, little gems, hidden gems that we would normally overlook.
That's so good. So good. Oh, I love it. Um, Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to end on that. That was too good. It was too good. It's so perfect. And I would encourage all of us, when we think of a woman's place in the world and we think of how women have been silenced, slandered, reduced to nothing, we can remember that survival plays a huge role. And one of the things that I really camp on in Pray Tell is how women stay silent because they don't have another option. that is
Yes.
the only option. And so I love that you
Yeah.
touched on survival, because I think of it in my own life. I found myself in a system where, to stay in the system, silence was the only welcomed option, and it was the only praised option, because loyalty was valued over conviction.
Yeah.
And I think as we move forward, it is so important to recognize w- the multiple factors somebody is going through, especially a woman, especially a marginalized woman. Think of all the different factors she is considering before she makes a move.
Yes.
And even as you talked about women in scripture, they didn't have something to fall back on. Survival,
Right.
trusting in Jesus was their only option. Like, there
Right.
was nothing to fall back on. There's a beauty in that, right? As you said, that is how we build resilience.
Mhm.
So I think it's just such a necessary, it's so necessary to consider all the factors. Remember who's in charge. Remember that the Lord is so faithful, and he does amplify the voices of women, and also to lean into that resilience and listen to those voices.
Amen.
So well said.
So good.
Rooting for you, Kat. So
Yeah.
excited
Can't wait
for
to read
all of
your
your work.
book.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
And again, just so excited to amplify your voice as I explore more of why we silence women and how everyone can speak up. And to
Yes.
find out more about Kat, you can search around this video, and all the information about her book and her work will be right there. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.